When you hear the term iambic pentameter, Petrarchan sonnet, usually you think about love, gentle feelings, yearning for the beloved, right? In fact, when I ask you to think about what constitutes poetry, you usually think about beautiful things and gentle emotions, don't you? Not William Butler Yeats. In the poems of Yeats, what we often come across is a very dark and mysterious idea that art is not always to soothe your senses. Today we are going to look closely at one such poem by W.B. Yeats, which is categorized as a Petrarchan sonnet, but is filled with themes of violence, resistance, and transformation. Stay with me till the end of this video as we read together William Butler Yeats's William Butler Yeats was one of the foremost figures of Irish literary movement. He wrote poetry, plays, and he was a very, very important figure during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He co-founded the Irish Literary Theatre in 1899, which later became the Abbey Theatre. When you look at his poems, you would find a very unique combination of Greek mythology, Irish folklore, Celtic mythology, and at the same time, the issues which were tormenting the modern man. Leda and the Swan, it's presumably written around 1923. It's part of his collection that was called The Tower. And the other poems which were part of this collection were poems like Among School Children, Sailing to Byzantium, The Tower. In this poem, we find that he is working with a story from the Greek mythology, a story which involves the characters Zeus and Leda. So first, let's just know a little bit about this story. Leda was a princess of King Theseus. She was married off to the Spartan king Tyndareus. One day after her marriage, Zeus, the chief god of the Greeks, he found Leda and got very attracted from up there in his throne. So he decided to come down from Mount Olympus. Now, the value system of the Greeks, especially when it comes to how the gods feel or act toward the humans, is not very acceptable according to our standards or values. So the Greek gods, they didn't much care about the idea of consent or whether any woman was willing to unite with them or not. Especially Zeus, he always ended up having a lot of relationships with mortals where the mortals were not even given any warning about his intentions. So a similar thing happens here. He comes down and he comes down in the shape of a swan, and he makes it look like the swan is chased by an eagle. So Leda was very worried about the swan and she shooed away the eagle. All right. But then the swan laid down beside Leda and forced himself upon her and ended up impregnating her. Afterwards, Leda, unable to resist this attempt, moves on with her life and then she stays with her husband. So what happens is that soon after her unique encounter with Zeus, Leda lays 1 or 2 eggs. In one version, it's 1 egg, and another version, it's 2 eggs. So the point is she gives birth to 2 sets of children. Okay, 2 children who are demigods, like they are born out of her union with Zeus, and 2 children who are born out of her union with her mortal husband. The demigod children were Helen, yes, the same Helen of Troy, and Pollux. And the mortal children, that is born with her husband, they were Clytemnestra and Castor. So you can say Clytemnestra and Helen, they were half-sisters. Now why I'm telling you this whole story is because This entire story is going to be very important if you are to understand the poem, because Yeats randomly refers to various characters who will be appearing in this story. So I will tell you the entire thing first. This Clytemnestra gets married to Agamemnon. Helen of Troy, as the story goes, she was either kidnapped or maybe she really wanted to go away. That is not very clear. But she was taken away by Paris, the Prince of Troy. Now, Helen was, when she was taken away, she was already the wife of Menelaus. So Menelaus wanted to get his wife back. So he wanted help from other Greek kings, and Agamemnon helped him. All right. And many of you already know that Troy was destroyed and Agamemnon was victorious, but he did not enjoy his victory for a long time, because when he returns from the Trojan War, by that time, his wife, Clytemnestra, that is Helen's half sister, was already engaged with another man, and she ends up murdering Agamemnon. So you see, what Yeats will be trying to tell us is that one incident, that is the encounter of Zeus with Leda, is basically the starting point of a series of events which actually have historical significance. So in a way, he will be trying to tell us that history, which moves in cycles, or in his words, it moves in gyres. Okay, like one age ends, another age begins. One era ends, another era begins. History is not formed by political events. Rather, they are triggered by very, very intimate personal events which have political consequences. Okay, so now we'll go through the poem, and because you already know this story, it will be easier for you to understand. This poem is structured like a sonnet, and in a sonnet, that is a Petrarchan sonnet, we have two parts. The first 8 lines, they are called the octave, which present a certain idea, and then we have the next 6 lines, or the sestate, where we have a kind of a different or antithetical idea, which either counters the first idea or somehow qualifies it in a different way, puts a different perspective to it. And there is a point in the poem where the octave and the sestate, they meet, and that point is the turning point or volta. So while we will be reading this, we will have to keep in mind that the first 8 lines will be presenting something, and then there will be a turn or the volta, after which we will go to a different perspective or a different aspect of the same incident. Look how the poem starts. A sudden blow, the great wings beating still above the staggering girl, her thighs caressed by the dark webs, her nape caught in his bill. He holds her helpless pressed upon his breast. The lines are written in such a way that while we are reading the first stanza, we often miss that it is basically rhymed. You see, it's A, B, A, B. Why are we missing this? Because Yeats doesn't end the sentence where the line is ending. So he is kind of carrying on the idea. And many of you already know what that is called. That is called an enjambment. When the sentence flows from one line into the other, forcing you to go on reading, although the line has stopped. Okay? The poem begins abruptly, without giving you any kind of context. The only context you have is obtained from the title. So if he hadn't given this title, we would have been really confused as to what this whole thing is about. Clearly, this is about the attack of Zeus disguised as a swan on Leda. Usually, the swan is considered to be a very elegant, graceful creature, and we have recurrent images of swans in Yeats's poetry. Maybe you have come across the poem The Wild Swans of Cool. So it's not that swans are generally considered to be very violent creatures. They are more or less associated with the idea of elegance. But here the swan takes on an added dimension. Why? Because it is not a real swan, it's Zeus hidden inside it. So this swan gives a sudden blow. So it begins with the attack. The great wings beating still above the staggering girl. Staggering is when you walk and you lose control of your steps, that you stagger. That means the swan is not just forceful, it's also very powerful. And you have to imagine this as a giant swan. It's not the normal, usual size swans you see around you, because this is a special kind of a swan. So this swan is still beating its wings and it's attacking this girl who is kind of losing her control, movement, and staggering. Her thighs caressed by the dark webs. Now the feet of the swan, they are joined together as webs that help them to swim. So in these lines, we get to understand that there is something very unnatural about the encounter, because her thighs are human, but the webs are bestial. It belongs to the bird. Therefore, there is something very, very disturbing and destabilizing about the encounter that is described here. That there is an element of disgust almost when this apparently non-compatible bodies are forced together. So her thighs are set against the dark webs. Her nape caught in his bill. Bill is that beak of the swan, which is very long and it has a good grip. So there is no question of romance, there is no question of any kind of graceful approach on the part of the swan. It's very, very animalistic because it is an animal after all. He holds her helpless breast upon his breast. And with the use of this unique alliteration of H, probably Yeats is also giving out this idea that Leda was exhaling and at the same time was at a loss for breath. She holds her helpless. So if you pronounce that, you yourself will understand the breathlessness that Leda must have felt at the moment. So it begins in a very violent way. What about the next 4 lines? How can those terrified, vague fingers push the feathered glory from her loosening thighs? And how can body, laid in that white rush, but feel the strange heart beating where it lies? So you have 2 rhetorical questions here. Let's look at the first question first. The first question asks how Leda could possibly have prevented the rape. She was so powerless, and her fingers were terrified and vague. Now, when he uses the word vague, possibly he also points at the ambiguous feelings that are going on in Leda's mind. Now, that is a very, very disturbing thing. If you talk about a situation where a woman is abused and you talk about the idea that maybe that woman was enjoying the whole thing, it's a very disturbing thing. Okay? It's not acceptable, not by our standards nowadays. But back in Yeats's days, or the kind of value system in which they were working, these kinds of ideas could have been a part of general thought that maybe Leda was interested, but she could not express her interest openly. It was repressed inside her. Okay, so it is kind of questioning the resistance of Leda, that whether she was really wanting to resist it. So that's why her fingers were vague, and that's why he's saying, how could she resist that? It was like temptation. And we all know the way women are treated when it comes to the topic of temptation. How could Eve resist Satan? She was too powerless. The same kind of idea might be brought in here. And if you talk about the Greeks, they hardly bothered about women's consent, women's choices, and stuff like that. So she couldn't push away the feathered glory. Now, this might this might be, you can say, a euphemism, an indirect way of referring to the sexual organ of the swan. So, how could she move away the body of the swan from her loosening thighs? Now, why were her thighs loosening? Was she getting interested in the whole thing? These are the things that are left in a very open ended manner, yet doesn't clarify his stand here. He just uses certain expressions which might point out that Leda was having, mixed thoughts. But the idea that is definitely brought out is that the swan didn't care. The last line of the octave goes like this: but feel the strange heart beating where it lies. So the swan's heart is strange compared to Leda, because of the swan's heart is what? Either it's a god's heart or it's a swan's heart. It's not a human heart. So obviously it is different from Leda's heart. So there is a general incompatibility between the two. So how could she overcome this gap, this incompatibility between the two hearts? Their breasts were all stuck together, but their hearts were beating differently. So while the swan violated the physical and emotional boundaries of Leda, we also see a kind of vagueness about Leda's resistance. And then comes the volta, or the turn, when we will be having a different tone. So till now the octave was dealing with the assault. The sestate, or the last 6 lines, will be dealing with the consequences. Interestingly, if you count the lines in some editions, you will see that there is a break, so that you actually have 7 lines and not 6. But you can take the 2 lines together. I'll refer to those when I'm coming to those lines. They sound like a sestate. And where is the volta? The volta is right here. A shudder in the loins engenders there. A shudder represents the climax of the moment, a climax which is not very clear who felt it. Was it Leda who was experiencing a kind of an orgasm, or was it the swan? That is not clearly given here, but there was a shudder. Someone experienced a moment of climax. The broken wall, the burning roof and tower, and Agamemnon dead. From where does Agamemnon come in all this? Agamemnon, as the story goes, I have already told you about it, will come much later. That is what Yeats is talking about here. That the point of climax in the encounter between the swan and Leda is the starting point. It's like it will have a snowball effect. It will have a rolling effect. A new era is about to begin, which will conclude with the death of Agamemnon. Okay? So this is how history is created from an intimate personal moment. The broken wall, the burning roof and tower, all these may refer to the destroyed city of Troy, whose walls were eventually breached. And it might also refer to the body of Leda, where the broken wall is clearly the broken hymen, because she was raped. And the broken wall, burning roof, tower all become a metaphor of the abused body of the woman. Okay? So you have 2 layers of symbolism working here, being so caught up. Now, this is where he is breaking up the line. If you count the 6 lines from a shudder, then you would see that if you join and Agamemnon dead with being so caught up, then it will make 6 lines, okay, till the end. But he deliberately breaks it up because he wants us to pause to understand the significance of that event, and he brings us back to the moment again. So he takes us away to Agamemnon, brings us back, so he deliberately breaks the line. And he says, being so caught up. Who is caught up? Leda is caught up. She is overpowered and she is emotionally caught up in the act or in the incident. So mustered by the brute blood of the air, because it is a swan, it belongs to the air. So its blood is also the blood of the air, and it's a brute, it's a beast. So Leda is overpowered by a beast. And beasts usually represent animalistic instinct and not intellectual or spiritual knowledge in any way. But here, again, we are given a different kind of an idea when he says, did she put on his knowledge with his power before the indifferent beak could let her drop? So, although the swan is associated with animal instincts and not with knowledge, well, in Indian mythology, we do associate swan with knowledge because swan is the vahan or the carriage of goddess Saraswati, and it carries the goddess of knowledge. That's a different thing. And yet, it had this very peculiar, strange way of somehow making us link all these Indian Vedic ideas. That's a different thing. But usually swans are associated with beauty, grace, and in this case, animalistic power, strength, stamina. But with knowledge, usually we do not associate that. Okay, so far as the Western thoughts are concerned. So this is not an ordinary swan. This swan carries the knowledge of the gods because it is Zeus actually. So what Yeats is saying is that in that brief moment when Leda was encountering Zeus, was she able to absorb at least some of the divine knowledge? So was that a moment where Leda herself became some kind of a goddess? Was it an initiation into divinity for her? Or did she remain as mortal as ever, as ordinary as ever? And the last line before the indifferent beak, this is very interesting because this is again, it points at the way in which the Greek gods looked at the humans. They were basically indifferent. Fate, the idea of fate is again coming in here. If you look at the Greek tragedies, you would see that fate does not have any consideration for your emotions. What is supposed to happen, happens. It doesn't matter how much you're weeping or crying over it. In a very similar way, the Greek gods have absolutely no botheration about how their actions might affect the humans. And so, his beak is indifferent. That is, he was holding on to her while it was interesting to him. But when the encounter was over, he simply let her drop. It's as if she has to bear the consequences now. So the human world has to bear the consequences of actions that are performed by gods. And that passes by the name of fate. Weird, isn't it? In fact, the word weird means fate if you look at the Old English form. So somehow, yes, fate is weird, isn't it? So the main idea of the poem is that Leda's rape literally changes the world, the fate of the world. It leads to a catastrophic war. Again, the war wasn't entirely a bad thing because you need a war in order to have a new era. So the swan, on one hand, is representing destruction, okay, because it is attempting or rather performing rape and violating a woman. So it is destructive, but it's also going to create something. This entire incident is going to create something. So the swan also represents creativity. And that is what gods are about. They are a combo pack of creation and destruction, and that very short-lived temporary moment of preservation. Ironical, right? Preservation should be longer. But here, the encounter between man and God is such a short-lived chunk of time that we can hardly call it a moment of preservation. So it's about destruction and creation all brought together in the idea of the swan. But it's not that Leda had any choice in it, because the Greek idea of fate leaves little room for choice. It's not the Renaissance idea of human beings defining their own destiny. No, it's very, very stark concept that no matter what you do, if the fate says you're going to marry your mother, you will. That's what we see in Oedipus too, right? And to further complicate the matters, we are given these hints and suggestions that Leda might have had ambivalent feelings towards this swan. And the most disturbing thing is that this violent episode is written using the sonnet form, which was usually used by the sonneteers during the Elizabethan period who were writing love sonnets, the Petrarchan sonnet using iambic pentameter. So, is it just about Greek mythology or the idea of political personal connection? No. One way of looking at it might also be that Yeats was writing this in and around 1923, and this was the period of Irish Civil War. And this poem was published later, but it was written during the Civil War, and it was a time of confusion and division in Ireland. So people also feel that maybe there is a connection between the way Leda and the Swan they are presented and the relation between Ireland and Britain. Britain with its power and its force, which always made Ireland feel cowered down, like Leda was feeling. And the moment of independence was also like, England was not interested anymore in Ireland. That kind of a movement, which we see at the end of this poem, the indifferent attitude of the swan. So, yes, you can extend these ideas because Yeats was very deeply connected to the politics or the political scenario that he was rooted in. So, wherever he wrote, Ireland, Irish movements, these were never out of his mind. Again, talking about Ireland, you also have some elements of Irish mythology infused in here. So it's not entirely Greek the way he is writing this. In Irish mythology, swans are associated with transformation, change, and they are the symbol of love and fidelity. This is what we understand in his poem, The Wild Swans of Cool. But here, that image is subverted. The idea of fidelity, loyalty, all these things doesn't even exist in the swan that we are seeing here. Rather, he presents the idea of power, the idea of knowledge, which is associated with the swans, and the idea of transformation. Swans can take human shape according to Irish folklore, and here he shows how a god transforms into a swan. The poem also references the myth of the Theat Danan, and that's a group of supernatural beings who actually brought in magic and wisdom to Ireland, it was believed. So knowledge, wisdom is brought in by an outside divine force. All right. And the same idea is brought in here, that the encounter between the world of the gods and the world of the humans brings about a sea change in human history. And that is why that line is important, that did she only get the physical seed from the swan, or did she manage to absorb some of the wisdom, some of the knowledge that we associate with gods? So in an encounter between man and God, how much is a human being capable of absorbing knowledge and wisdom at all? That is a question worth thinking about. Again, because it's a modern poem, you must also understand the things that make this poem a modern poem. The first and the most important thing is the fragmented way in which he manipulates the shape of a sonnet. So he's taking a traditional form and adapting it to suit the modern way of writing poetry. So you don't have a very obvious looking rhyming pattern, though he strictly follows a rhyming pattern. It doesn't sound like you're listening to rhyming words here. So the structure is fragmented. He breaks up line abruptly, and this is like a resistance to tradition. And resistance to tradition is the hallmark of modernism. Second is the use of symbolism, the way he is expanding the symbols which is there. He is not just sticking down to the Greek symbols or the Irish symbols. He is playing with all kinds of possibilities here. And of course, he's exploring the darker aspects of human experience, human psychology, and possibly also talking about the divide between your unconscious and your conscious lives. The study of human psychology was a dominant discourse for the novelists like T.H. Lawrence, later on in Virginia Woolf, James Joyce. So in poetry, it was very natural to find in the moderns a kind of exploration of these darker sides of human psyche, where things are left open ended, vague, and unresolved. Okay, because the idea that meanings exist, that is destabilized in modern literature. And additionally, the poem's subject matter and the violent erotic encounter between a mortal woman and a god in the form of a swan, it speaks to the modernist fascination with the irrational and the unconscious and all that. So the idea of gaining on or putting on Zeus's all-seeing knowledge, including his knowledge of future, because Zeus must know everything, he's a god. So while impregnating Leda, did Zeus know that it's going to be the beginning point for the Trojan War, again for the death of Agamemnon and all that? These questions are asked in a rhetorical way without any answers. But we understand that these questions actually answer themselves. That no, gods are too selfish to pass on their knowledge. Leda's importance only lies in that moment of violation. And that is the irony. There had been innumerable number of paintings, some very famous ones, on this encounter, where nothing is touched upon about the consequences of that act. That act makes Leda important to posterity, to future generations, even to the future generation of artists. So if you are attempting a feminist reading of this poem, you can also talk about the dehumanization of Leda. That this poem is not just about a god turning into an animal, but the way in which the god turns a human into an animal, a beast. Because whatever human is seen in the swan, in its assertion, in its movements, in her passivity, in her powerlessness. Leda hardly passes for a human here. So this is a poem showing the transformation of not just a divine figure into a beast, but also the dehumanization of a woman's figure. So it's a poem with multiple possibilities of interpretation. Naturally, I must have missed quite a lot. So if you have any other way of looking at this poem, I would really love to know that. So write that down in the comment section. I hope you enjoyed today's class, but I've seen that many of you are watching videos but not subscribing. Well, see, it only makes us feel better that we are serving more students. So it kind of feels good if you subscribe. So you might consider that, okay? And if you have already subscribed, thank you so much. Share these videos with your friends. Until we meet again, this is Monami Mukherjee signing off. Bye-bye.